続きまして、本日2つ目のラウンドテーブルに
Next, we would like to move on to the second roundtable for today. The theme is Sustainable Society. We would like to kindly ask Senior Lecturer at the School of Media, Creative Arts and Social Inquiry of the Curtin University, Dr. HOFMANN, to provide us to play the role as a chair. The floor is yours.
Okay. Welcome everyone to this panel, the panel on sustainable society. My name is Reto HOFMANN and I'm chairing this panel. First of all, I'd like to wish WIAS a very happy 15th birthday, and I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me to these celebrations. I was an associate professor here at WIAS until not so long ago, and it certainly was one of the highlights of my career. So it's a great pleasure to be here again. The format of this panel, just a few words about that. It will follow like this. I will introduce the speakers very briefly, and then the speakers will give their papers back to back. I'm told they have about 9 minutes for their presentations. After that, I will very briefly again discuss the papers as a whole, and I hope that towards the end we will still have some time for questions and answers. So, let me introduce the speakers. ANNAKA Susumu will be our first speaker. He is assistant professor at Hirosaki University. He received his PhD from Waseda in political science. And today he will present a comparative study of COVID-19 responses in different national contexts. UNNO Noriko, assistant professor here at WIAS. She received her PhD in area studies from the University of Tokyo, and her research is a historical study of Sinophone Muslims, and today she will talk a little bit about interethnic relations among Muslim and non-Muslim societies. YAMAMURA Shu is associate professor at Tokyo Metropolitan University. He also received his PhD from Waseda in urban planning and regional design. His talk will deal with the problem of aging in society and social isolation. Last, Brent is associate professor here at WIAS. He received his PhD in international education policy from the University of Maryland, and in his talk he will present his research about the teaching of sustainable development in schools. So, without further ado, can I ask ANNAKA Sensei to present his talk? Thank you.
Pleased to speak to you. My name is ANNAKA from Hirosaki University. I have made a similar report several times at WIAS, but I'm sure that many of you hear this presentation for the first time, so I'm very much looking forward to talking to you. So political regimes, there are democracies, there are authoritarian regimes, and how does that impact or interrelate with COVID cases? I'll be speaking based on statistics, but I will not get into too much detail, but give you an overview. Now, the question that came to mind is that authoritarian countries, such as China, I wouldn't say dictatorships, but the authoritarian countries have been relatively successful in fighting COVID-19. This has been said for several years now. On the other hand, democracies like US and Europe seem to have more deaths resulting from COVID-19. So many researchers have said that authoritarian countries are more successful in keeping COVID deaths down because they can swiftly limit the freedom of their citizens to prevent the spread of the disease. On the other hand, democracies are not able to control the freedom of their citizens. So, was this really true? I have been studying whether this hypothesis is correct. So, I will give you the conclusion first. My conclusion that I reached is that authoritarian countries are not likely to have fewer COVID-19 deaths because they have more issues in terms of data transparency. If we control for data transparency, my conclusion was that democracies and authoritarian countries do not have much of a difference in COVID deaths. So data transparency is of critical importance. And if you study the difference in data transparency, then the difference amongst countries is not so much. And if you study the excess mortality, which is able to overcome the data transparency issue. So looking at not the COVID-related mortality that is being presented by each country, actually in terms of the excess mortality, democratic countries may have an advantage. Now let me start from this graph. So authoritarian countries are doing better. So the countries like China would present this kind of graph as evidence that they are better in handling COVID. On the x-axis, polity and MPI, these are basically measuring the level of democracy. The more you get to the right, the higher the liberty, the higher the level of democracy. So these dots are all countries. And so the more democratic, the more to the right on the x-axis. And the death is on the y-axis. So if you look at this, it looks like more liberal democratic countries, meaning the more you shift toward the right on the x-axis, the number of deaths seems to be increasing. So this is studying like 170, 180 countries. And this seems to be a very prevalent trend that democracies are weaker against COVID. So these are the statistical figures that is used as evidence when arguing that authoritarian countries are better. But these are based on the number of deaths resulted from COVID that each country reports. So we have to look at the transparency of data in order to verify whether this is correct. So we looked at the quality of data using economic data and so on. We have been able to garner what is the level of transparency of each country. So if we put that on the x-axis, so rather than the level of democracy as shown in the previous graph, if you take transparency index on the x-axis and the y-axis is the same. So that's on the vertical. And actually, that relationship that we saw between democracy and death is quite different from the transparency index. The higher the transparency, the higher the amount of reported deaths. So, liberal democracies in general provide more transparent data, and authoritarian countries like China have a problem in data transparency. So if we look at the quality of data being submitted by each country, then we should have a further study or analysis. So in the paper that I published last year, I used data from about 120 countries and created a model to predict the number of deaths and looked at various polity scores and conducted an analytical regression analysis. So what I came up with is that on the left-hand side, there's this bar, or a line from top to bottom. That's the level of democracy. And the right hand is another vertical line. That's the transparency index. And if the line does not cross 0, then it is statistically significant. So level of democracy actually it goes over 0, meaning that statistically we cannot say that democracy has a correlation with the number of deaths. On the other hand, transparency index, clearly it has an impact on the number of deaths. So the higher the transparency, the higher the number of reported COVID deaths. So the correct number of deaths is being reported. So after controlling for transparency, actually democracy has nothing to do with the number of COVID deaths. What is most important is the transparency of data. So countries that are more transparent, basically countries that are democratic and liberal, tends to have a higher reporting on the death resulting from COVID. So this is a prediction model. How higher the level of transparency index impacts, the higher the number of reported deaths. So the higher the transparency in data, the higher the number of deaths being reported by the country. So analysis cannot be conducted without taking transparency into consideration. So there is a significant correlation between the transparency of data and the number of deaths being reported. And so without transparency, authoritarian or democratic regimes do not impact the number of deaths from COVID. So after publishing this paper, I spoke to these very well-known experts, and it was reported that the evidence supporting the existence of autocratic advantage is weak because researchers like ANNAKA control for data transparency, and actually the impact from autocracy democracy was small after controlling for data transparency. And there is another analysis that was conducted. Perhaps considering the political regime, rather than authoritarian regimes having an advantage, perhaps democracies have an advantage. So we used the excess mortality to reconduct the analysis. We looked at the government effectiveness and how the government effectiveness impacts excess mortality or deaths from COVID. And this is quite confusing perhaps, but MPI is the level of democracy or freedom. So 0 are countries that have very little MPI. And in such countries, even if the government effectiveness goes up, the amount of mortality from COVID does not change. On the other hand, countries like Japan or Europe or US, if it is a more democratic countries with a higher MPI score, the higher the government effectiveness, the lower the deaths from COVID or the lower the excess mortality. So using this data, we found that democracies do have an advantage over authoritarian countries. So my conclusion is that COVID studies have a lot of data issues and it could be very biased. So we need to conduct analysis controlling for such factors. And if data transparency or data quality is taken into consideration, then perhaps there is no difference between authoritarian and democratic countries. And in some cases, democracies may have an advantage. So China and Russia, authoritarian countries may say that they are more advantageous, but we should not abandon democracy, even during this pandemic. Thank you very much.
We'll move on straight to Unno Sensei. Thank you.
Thank you for the introduction, Professor Hoffmann, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Noriko Unno, Assistant Professor at WIAS, and in this presentation, I'd like to discuss how to create a sustainable society from a culture and historical perspective. So, as you know, in every part of the world, protecting cultural diversity has become a very urgent issue in the age of globalization. And for example, Muslims who have migrated to secular countries in the last few decades have faced difficulties in practicing Islam and misconceptions and also dealing with misconceptions and prejudice against Islam. And in some prefectures in contemporary Japan, local residents have opposed to building mosques and Muslim burial sites in their towns because they believe that Muslims would cause a lot of troubles, and some of them even regard Muslims as terrorists. And so in this presentation, to propose how to create a sustainable society, I'd like to present a case study of Muslims in China who have struggled to overcome prejudice and preserve their unique culture for centuries. So there are approximately 23 million Muslims in the People's Republic of China today, including the Hui, Uyghurs, and Kazakhs, and other ethnic minorities who adhere to Islam, one of the religions officially recognized by the Chinese Communist Party. And in recent years, China's crackdown on Islam has been widely reported by the media. So I think you have heard of this before. But the Chinese government claims that they have achieved ethnic harmony and multicultural coexistence, multicultural sustainability. So even though I use the term multicultural sustainability in this presentation to make my discussion suitable for this session, we have to be aware that these concepts can be used by political powers to legitimize their rules over ethnic and religious minorities in their territories. And among the 10 ethnic groups in China who adhere to Islam, maybe Uyghurs in Xinjiang or Shinkyo Uyghur Jichiku in Japanese are the most famous people, maybe in the media. But I'd like to focus on the Hui people or Kaizoku in Japanese. And they are Sinophone Chinese-speaking Muslims, and they are the descendants of the foreign Muslims who migrated from today's Middle East, Central Asia, and Southeast Asia to China from the 7th to 14th centuries. And today they speak Chinese as their mother tongue, and their physical appearances look just like Han Chinese, but they have a very unique ethnic and religious identity distinct from Han Chinese. And in the pre-modern period, the Hui people were treated as Han Chinese by the Ming and Qin dynasties, and they were often discriminated as potential criminals in official documents. And their non-Muslim neighbors, mostly Han Chinese, derided Muslims' religious practices, especially their dietary customs, which sometimes escalated into intense violence between the two groups. And during the Muslim rebellions against the Qing Empire, hundreds of thousands of Muslims were tortured and massacred. And after these incidents, in the early 20th century, Muslim intellectuals in large cities such as Beijing, Peking, Tianjin, Tenshin, and Shanghai decided to elevate the social status of Muslims and to survive in Chinese society. And there were mainly three solutions that Muslim intellectuals in modern China proposed and carried out. So the first solution was to reform education. So these Muslim intellectuals taught young people modern scientific knowledge and business skills instead of Arabic and Islam to raise Muslims' living standards and make them obey laws regardless of backlash from some conservative people. And some Muslims received modern education at Japanese institutions, actually including Waseda University. And so this picture is one of the earliest Chinese Muslim periodicals, which was published in Tokyo in the early 20th century. And the second solution to survive in Chinese society was to have dialogue with non-Muslims. For instance, Muslims run soup kitchens for vulnerable people, and they also offered educational opportunities to young people regardless of their religious beliefs. And when non-Muslims attacked Muslims physically or psychologically, Muslim intellectuals invited the offenders to mosques to have conversations about religion and peace. And so Muslims in modern China came to have more interactions with non-Muslims in this period, and as far as I know, these attempts were successful to some extent because the number of clashes between Muslims and non-Muslims decreased after Muslim intellectuals carried out these reforms. And the third solution was to show obedience to the state. And so Muslim intellectuals supported the Qing and Republican governments, Minkok Seifu, and cooperated with their policies. And they even pretended to pray to the so-called imperial tablets, as you see the picture in the slide. So this is imperial tablet, which the Qing dynasty forced every mosque in China to have. And so Muslims pretended to pray to these tablets only in front of government officials. And in contemporary China, just like during the Qing dynasty, most of the mosques have propaganda posters and pictures of President Xi Jinping to show their obedience to the state and survive the ongoing crackdown on Islam. And under such circumstances, some Muslims have given up going to mosque. And instead of attending prayer, these Muslims donate money to mosque to financially support the Muslim community they belong to. So this is the way how Muslims in contemporary China have tried to survive in a secular communist state. And this is the last slide. So in this presentation, I have demonstrated that Muslims in China have struggled to resolve conflicts with their non-Muslim neighbors through dialogue, and they also made a lot of compromises with political powers. And so based on the historical experiences of Muslims in China, my conclusion is that a sustainable society is a society where conflicts between different groups can be resolved, not through violence, but through dialogue. And to create such a society, it is obvious that not only Muslims, but also non-Muslims and the authorities need to make efforts. Okay, that's all. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, UNNO Sensei. Can I ask Yamamura Sensei to give his talk? Thank you.
Hello everyone, I'm Yamamura from Tokyo Metropolitan University. I'd like to talk about loneliness and cities. In order to contribute to the well-being of cities, we need to have formation of active living and healthy lifestyle. For example, exercise, going out, and social activities in general should be enhanced to improve well-being. And this would lead to less reliance on advanced medical care and prevent pre-symptomatic diseases from developing. So today I'd like to talk about new urban design ideas for super-aging society, focusing on loneliness from two case studies. First is we'd like to look at the so-called danchi, which is a housing complex in some of the urban environments. In Japan, many elderly people are living alone due to the rise in divorce and people not getting married and aging society in general. And even if you are living alone, we need to create contact points of society and enable healthy living. social isolation and loneliness is what the elderly suffer from when they live alone. And we need to consider two types of this disconnection. In Japan, there is much study on social isolation. However, there is less study on loneliness. So this shows the distribution of elderly people living alone in Tokyo. And red shows higher hotspots of elderly people living alone. And most of these are housing complexes, multi-unit apartments. So there are some specific areas with higher concentration of elderly people living alone, and there is much that urban planning can do. So we conducted a study on the Mutsumi-dai Danchi, which is on the outskirts of the central Tokyo and has a very high level of those living alone. So this apartment became available from 1973, managed by Urban Renaissance Agency. There are 3 huge buildings with 1,261 units in total. This shows the inside. This is in a pretty good area. However, since 50 years have passed since this danchi was opened, there is a significant aging, as well as the aging of the building, not just the residents. So with the support of the neighborhood association, we conducted questionnaires to 360 households with senior citizens, of which 149 responded. And we found that there was no correlation between social isolation and living alone. However, there was a strong correlation between loneliness and solitary residence. So this is a study on the correlation and various factors. Actually, the highest correlation came from the frequency of outings, which was even higher than the presence of neighbors or frequency of meeting relatives. Even if they don't physically meet someone, taking a walk outside may help them feel more connected to society and less likely to feel lonely. And we also conducted face-to-face surveys and asked why are they going out, what is the purpose, what frequency. And there were some people who were not lonely at all. And we found that these elderly were taking walks for about a 2-kilometer diameter, a very wide area compared to what was expected. In conventional studies, the elderly's daily range is about 500 meters, but actually we found that these elderlies are actually walking at a much wider range. And for example, they said that they would like to have a set of small parks and some benches and safe walkways and so on. So this is a concept diagram of a loneliness-free urban design. So having more benches and rest areas, having open space, having better access for walkers. And so we found that having about a 2-kilometer range of areas that people can take a walk is helpful in addressing loneliness. The second is the need for comfortable places to spend time alone during COVID-19. During COVID, there was a higher level of stress and loneliness, as well as the negative effects of telework. So we studied what are the outside spaces, public open spaces that is necessary in the era of telework area. So we conducted studies based on 2 starting points. One is that people with more leisure time outings are less lonely. The second starting point was that outdoor walks can reduce mental fatigue. So this is a different research that we conducted several years ago. So this is the image that I came up with. Outside space where you can feel the city and the nature will be able to bring down the stress and sense of loneliness of people working from home. So we need to learn what is the required public open space for people during COVID. So take a look at this picture. During the time of the state of emergency where people are not able to go out, many people came out to these public open spaces to spend time alone in silence. It was to escape the suffocating home environment doing teleworking and just to relax in an outer space area. There is a lot of attention in community hubs. But perhaps we're forgetting the importance of a comfortable place for being alone. So when you are teleworking and feeling lonely, perhaps we still need a place that is public, outdoors, but alone. My students conducted studies on this. So we asked about 52 favorite locations of university students for spending time during COVID. And we also asked why this place was favorable. And they said that having an anonymous but a relationship with those who are outside together feels important. People who just happen to be there surrounding you. This silent communication with the people you don't know who are sitting next to you. This helped to ease the sense of loneliness for the university students. So based on this finding, I have come back to the same diagram as before. I feel that this loneliness-free urban design is more important than ever. Now, the home is a place to work as well, and you need a place to escape that. You need a place of dialogue between human and urban space to feel both the town and the nature. And so this living environment has become more and more important. And you need a walkable town, a neighborhood where you feel like you want to take a walk. And this is not just for the elderly, but also for the younger generation who are working from home and require a relaxing outdoor space. So, what can urban planning contribute for a healthy urban living? There is a limit to what we can do. We are just one amongst the many chess pieces. But when it comes to loneliness, creating a public space, creating a walkway, there are many roles that we can play in urban planning to address loneliness. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yamamura Sensei. And our last speaker is Edward Sensei. Please.
Okay, can you hear me all right? Very good. So first, my name is Brent Edwards, and I'm in my first year at WIAS. I'm an associate professor. I would like to thank the organizers for the invitation. It's very nice to be at an in-person symposium. I haven't done this in a long time, so I appreciate that. It's an honor to be here. Today I will present some findings from a study that connects the focus of the symposium. Although this study is related both to education for sustainable development and global citizenship education, I'll be focusing on the first half, the part that's more connected to education for sustainable development. My comments today are more fully elaborated in an article that was recently published. If anybody is interested, I would be happy to share that. To start, we can note that both education for sustainable development and global citizenship education have drawn a lot of attention in recent years, particularly after the approval of the Sustainable Development Goals in South Korea in 2015. In particular, there's a goal, there's a target associated with the Sustainable Development Goals with the following language, target 4.7, you see here. And the goal is to ensure that all learners acquire the knowledge and skills needed to promote sustainable development through education for sustainable development and sustainable lifestyles, human rights, gender equality, promotion of a culture of peace and nonviolence, global citizenship, and appreciation of cultural diversity and culture's contribution to sustainable development. As an aside, you can imagine that at the final drafting of these targets, they couldn't agree on what to include, so they put everything into one target. On the practical side, this is very difficult of how to monitor and measure this, but for the time being, the language in the targets is as such. In practice, there have been various educational programs that have been both put into implementation and researched, but our starting point was the fact that nobody had tried to systematize the available research on this topic. Focusing on the second point there, what we did was, in this study, we decided to carry out a systematic literature review to see what kinds of studies are available that connect to each of the dimensions of the definition of education for sustainable development in the Sustainable Development Goals. So you see there that the methodology is not what's important here. I do have more information about that, but we sought out studies that connected with each of these dimensions. So sustainable development, human rights, gender equality, et cetera, et cetera. My focus today is on the studies related to education for sustainable development because that's the focus of the symposium. So what we did was, or what we hoped to do through this study, is what you see in those first two bullet points. We hoped to be able to kind of document and reflect on the contributions of the literature to a discussion on how to strengthen learning and teaching. Because much of the world is talking about how can we achieve sustainability, but if you don't teach people about that and its importance, you're not going to have much success in making progress on that. However, as I will emphasize in a moment, we were somewhat disappointed with the literature, with what the literature revealed. But first, let me say that what kind of literature are we talking about? In the end, despite the fact that we started with initial search results of over 1,000, in the end we were only able to identify 14 studies that documented a positive, statistically significant outcome related to education for sustainable development. And that means 14 for all those dimensions of that very complex definition. So you have all these different issues and topics, and across all of them, there's only 14 studies that exist. What that means is it's very hard to draw broad lessons. Even though what we were seeking to do, and so we included those studies related to those different dimensions and related to their outcomes, what they intended to accomplish, and then what they did accomplish in practice related to curriculum, learners, and the educational contexts in which they were implemented. So you see here that within those 14, there were 6 that were specifically focused on education for sustainable development. Geographically, they were mostly focused on Europe, the United States, and then Turkey. And then with regards to what these studies attempted to accomplish was both to teach students about sustainability issues and then also to encourage them to put their new knowledge into practice. Okay. Now, having said that as background, I'll make a few comments about the literature specifically, and then a few more macro comments in the following 2 slides as I wrap up. So the studies available do demonstrate positive effects in terms of increasing students' knowledge about sustainability, their attitudes towards sustainability, their attitudes, their dispositions, their willingness to change their behavior. So that's very encouraging. I can mention that the kinds of topics that these educational programs included were among, some examples include, learning about climate change, environmental degradation, how to live more sustainably, the Sustainable Development Goals in general, how do we define and understand what sustainable development is, how to apply this new content knowledge to real-world case studies in the context of the classroom, And what's interesting is that the more successful examples for students were those examples that didn't talk about sustainability and climate change in the abstract at the global level, but that made these issues more digestible and more relatable by focusing on their immediate geographical context. So thinking about the communities or the regions where students are living, as opposed to trying to talk about and have students digest these lessons at a global scale. Having said that, some of the limitations of the literature include some of these bullets here. So while the studies do, in addition to the fact that there are very few studies that do demonstrate positive effects, one of the problems is that they focus on outcomes, but if you want to learn lessons from the studies, it's difficult because they don't give you sufficient information on who the students were, what their characteristics were, nor the kinds of educational contexts in which the programs were implemented. Because if you want to learn lessons to replicate successful programs elsewhere, you need to know who was your population that you were working with, and then what were the kinds of organizational and pedagogical circumstances so that you can think about how can we translate these lessons for elsewhere. Okay. I'd like to focus on this last bullet point at the bottom here about context of implementation. So kind of building off my previous comment. One of the, so thinking more in a more macro sense, right, about, I've said a little bit about the literature and its challenges, but more generally when it comes to education for sustainable development, some of the broader challenges relate to political commitment and providing resources to actually put these programs into practice. I've been very impressed with the prevalence of the discourse of the Sustainable Development Goals here in Japan. Certainly in the United States, where I come from, it's not to that level. And so that's just one kind of anecdote. But what I'm kind of getting at here is that there's a disconnect between kind of commitments at the global level and then kind of commitments at the national level. And then even within that, one of the things that I talk about in the classes that I teach with my students is that it's a long way from national commitments to the classroom level. And how are those more macro level commitments being communicated and translated and then taught to teachers? Because one of the main takeaways here is related to formal teacher training. So teachers don't teach things at all, or if they do, they don't teach them well if they don't know the material well themselves. This is one of the main kind of areas for growth, for focus going forward. In addition to that, my last two comments relate to policy and theory. So yes, one of the questions is how can we better teach teachers? How can we better motivate teachers to address these lessons in their classes? And how can we address the gap between policy and practice at the national and then at the classroom level? But then lastly, just to zoom out one more time, the question of kind of the frameworks within which we're operating. So one of the things, nobody today has said the word capitalism, right? So there's a contradiction within the Sustainable Development Goals themselves, because there are goals about reducing emissions, but at the same time, not to the level sufficient to curb climate change. And so there are like tensions within the Sustainable Development Goals themselves that should be addressed, because your perspective on things like the economic system, or more culturally, the relationship between the individual and society, and the relationship between the individual and nature, how your assumptions about these things are inherently inform how you teach about what sustainability means, and how can that be addressed and how should that be addressed, are informed by your assumptions about what should the economic system look like and what should the relationship between the individual and society look like, because arguably there's an east-west divide or a kind of a global north, global south divide with regards to Western perspectives versus more indigenous perspectives on the relationship between the individual and nature, for example. So I think that some of these things are kind of in the background and they don't get enough attention when we talk about how do we teach people to be more sustainable. I think that some of these broader, more larger issues should also be part of the debate. So that's it for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Edward Sensei, and thank you all for your very interesting papers. Now, what brings these papers together is that they address the question of sustainability from different angles and from different disciplines, and in my comments I would like to reflect a little bit on the methodological potential of this concept, sustainability. Now, I should premise by saying that I am not a scholar working on sustainability. I'm a historian, but I am interested in the history of this concept, sustainability, and other concepts that have closely accompanied sustainability, such as development or resilience. Now, as probably people know, sustainability broke into public parlance in the 1980s when Gro Harlem Brundtland defined sustainable development as, and I quote, development that meets the needs of the present generation without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And in fact, today we hear the word sustainability a little bit everywhere. For example, most famously, the United Nations has its SDGs, its Sustainable Development Goals. We are all watching the World Cup, and Qatar claims that this World Cup will be the most sustainable in history, and in fact has, among other things, built a stadium, I understand, almost entirely out of shipping containers, with the view that, of recycling these containers in the future. My own university keeps reminding me about budget sustainability. So, in other words, in economics, in culture, in politics, sustainability has thoroughly pervaded the way we discuss the global present and the global future. So, the explanatory power of sustainability seems to me to be an interesting way to bring these four papers together. And in particular, I am interested in the, if you want, elasticity of this concept. How much can sustainability be stretched to cover different areas, different disciplines, and even different historical periods? So I guess the question that I would like to ask all of you is, to what extent does sustainability as a concept, as you understand it, help you to understand the subject of your research? And in particular, I would like to ask ANNAKA Sensei the following. ANNAKA Sensei shows how the pandemic, as a time of crisis, has stretched our political systems to extremes. Emergency measures were developed, and people started to question the power of the state vis-à-vis the rights or the freedoms of the individual. The relationship between state power and individual freedom is, of course, a very sensitive one, and governments have had various degrees of success in devising a sustainable balance. So how could we think this through by using the concept sustainability? Could we think of it as pandemic sustainability? Would that even make much sense as an idea? UNNO Sensei examines the nature of coexistence between Muslims and other ethnic communities, and she shows early on how multicultural sustainability is used by the Chinese government as a framework to create harmonious communities. As a historian, I would like to ask, as a historian, how comfortable would you be to use sustainability as a way to understand policies towards minorities, but in earlier eras, 19th century or early 20th century? Is that an interesting, useful way to understand what communities and governments did in that context? Yamamura Sensei discusses the relationship between urban planning and well-being in a society that is rapidly aging, showing that isolation and loneliness are a direct result of this process. My question to you is the urban design that you propose, that you are thinking of, is that informed by an engagement on your part with notions of sustainability? Is the scholarship around sustainability helpful to devise the solutions that you are proposing? And last, Edward Sensei is he's researching the teaching of sustainable development in schools, and so perhaps works most directly with notions within the scholarship of sustainable development. And I would like to ask you how, and you have been self-critical yourself, you've pointed to the contradictions that are necessary to take into consideration, but I guess the question is, how comfortable are you with a concept that is over 40 years old? Is it still, has it outlived its epistemic potential? Is sustainability still sustainable? And I guess seeing sustainability used across these various disciplines as we have heard today, is that a sign of the vitality of the concept, or do you think, or is it being stretched too much? Thank you all.
Thank you very much, Professor Hoffmann. Please allow me to answer first. So the word sustainability, perhaps my take on sustainability is slightly different from what is being used widely in society today. China's zero-COVID policy is breaking down these days. And the reason was that these authoritarian policies may work in the beginning, but they are not sustainable. So the word sustainability that I use in relation to political regimes may be more close to its original meaning. So Russia as well, through these authoritarian controls, information was severely controlled with regards to the war in Ukraine. But still, various criticism arise from the military and from the citizens. So limiting information, controlling information may not be sustainable in the long term. So as economies have developed and information society has progressed and people have knowledge of democracy and freedom. And this is widely known throughout the world. And when you try to take these authoritarian measures and limit people's freedom or access to information, these policies are not sustainable. People's democracy, people's freedom. Perhaps human nature is not the right word when we consider the historical aspect, but we can't really go against people's will for democracy and freedom, because I do not think that it is a sustainable way forward for governments. That is how I see the COVID and the war in Russia. So this sustainability may be different from what is meant in SDGs. But the sustainability of political regimes, I believe, is another factor of sustainability. So what I'm trying to say is that in the long run, more democratic, more liberal policies are sustainable. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for your insightful question and comments. And I try to my answer very short, but I usually do not use the term sustainability in my study because in contemporary China and also in historical China during the Qing and Republican periods, maybe development or sustainability or like multicultural coexistence, like these kind of concepts were used by political powers to legitimize their rules over ethnic and religious minorities. So I avoid using these terms. But after joining this session, I came to think what would be a sustainable society for Muslims in China. And so before joining this session, I didn't really think about sustainability. Like I didn't associate this concept with my research. So it was very challenging for me to participate in this session. And also I came to think about how we researchers could contribute to the sustainable society which Muslims in China imagine. So I don't know if I have answered your question correctly, but I keep thinking about this. Thank you.
英語でいいですか?
Should I speak in English or Japanese?
I think modern urban planning has always been dealing with some sort of sustainability historically. And because for urban planning, I think the social sustainability first became such a big issue in the time of Industrial Revolution. And at that period, living environment was heavily damaged because of pollution by industry. And so many planners tried to reconstruct a more humane lifestyle in the suburbs, getting away from the city center. They tried to reconstruct new lifestyle in good harmony with a natural environment. And that period, I think the sustainability for urban planners was mostly about sustaining people's ordinary daily lives. But today, the area of interest of the planners towards sustainability is getting wider. Of course, nowadays we have to deal with the super aging society problem. Also, we have to tackle with economical transformation. And of course, we also have to think about the sustainability of the planet. And in addition, on top of that, planners also should think about the urban culture itself, how to develop it and succeed to the next generation. So like that, I think the definition and area of interest of the urban planners towards sustainability has gradually enlarged, first to the diverse people groups, and next to even non-human elements, such sustainability. So my research is also positioned within such a context, I think.
Thank you very much for that wonderful question. How comfortable am I with the concept of sustainability, and is sustainability sustainable? I don't know. I think that one of the things that come out of our literature review is that sustainability means many different things to many different people, and it's put into practice in many different ways. I think that the concept has a plasticity, a flexibility, a moldability that I think that I'm not sure what it means. I don't know about you guys. I'm not sure what it means when somebody says it unless they define it for me in their specific context and the way that they're using it. And I think that this plasticity also makes it very easily co-optable. And one of the things that I personally that stands out to me generally in the discussion of sustainability is the absence of a discussion of power and equity globally and within individual societies. I mean, that we can dream up policy solutions, but how do we get corporations to cooperate with new taxes or other strategies to get them to reduce their emissions? And I'm particularly not sure how that works when there's typically such a close relationship between corporations and the politicians who are supposed to hold them accountable. So like, where are these kinds of discussions, not necessarily today, but in general, in my observations of how the sustainability debate is covered? Another observation is that, when it comes to is sustainability sustainable, most international agreements, if not all, are non-binding. So there are wonderful agreements, but how are we going to achieve them? An alternative concept that has caught my attention in recent years is the idea of degrowth. So there's a conversation around how do we change our economic model from a growth-oriented model to a degrowth model. I'm not sure how capitalism can be sustainable, particularly not on a global scale when, in my observation, and my work is very international, I spend a lot of time in countries of the global south, low-income countries. The global south is replicating the economic model of the global north. So even if we make marginal changes in the global north, I'm not sure how, on a planetary basis, we're going to be sustainable anytime soon. So I mean, I'm interested in these kinds of conversations. And then the last one is that how do we get people to change how they are? I think studies have shown that people don't respond to statistics. I think you have to establish an affective connection. I think that people are starting to respond to experiential learning. And so how do we create those kinds of experiences to try to encourage people to change how they behave? And I think that, as my final comment, the research that I'm most inspired by in this regard is actually coming out of some of my colleagues at Kyoto University, who have shown that those societies that are less individualistic are more sustainable. So that means, like, how can we change how we understand our relationships and our obligations to each other and to nature, not only to this an abstract concept of sustainability? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm told that we are out of time, but I'm sure you agree with me that this was a very rich panel with a lot of interesting discussions. So perhaps we can go over by a few minutes. So maybe we can take just a couple of questions from the audience.
Yep. Yeah, thank you all for incredibly interesting presentations and very kind of diverse kind of perspectives on the same topic. I was interested also in this kind of discussion of sustainability. But also in the previous panel, it was interesting to see James Morris as a kind of historian and also theologian kind of express a kind of opinion on the kind of different moral and ethical questions related to climate change, etc. And I think that that kind of perspective is, in my opinion, kind of missing to some extent, because I think that climate change is actually best understood as Edward Sensei said, is best understood as a form of kind of political theology in a kind of affective sort of context to some extent, because I think people have a very kind of distinct difficulty in kind of understanding the urgency of this kind of discourse, right? If climate change is going to result in a kind of apocalypse, in the end of the world, then why is it not a state of exception, as Carl Schmitt says? A state of exception would create a kind of imperative for the state to force corporations to adhere to certain rules, instead of, trying to induce them within a kind of economic kind of system, right? So I would say that is there not this kind of opportunity to kind of expand on this idea of climate change as sort of, I don't know, it's already been expressed as a kind of form of political theology to some extent. Then, I mean, indeed, the term sustainability itself is almost a kind of theological concept. It's kind of very mutable, as various speakers have kind of said. So I just wondered what the kind of panelists and his opinion on that kind of idea. Is it, I mean, it's not surely only a kind of engineering, economic, or political science question. It's there's a kind of another perspective missing, which might make it a more urgent issue.
Okay, thank you very much for that comment. It's a very broad comment. Maybe who would like to give their thoughts? ANNAKA Sensei.
Thank you for the question. Please allow me to kickstart. Recently, Kohei Saito, currently in University of Tokyo, his book is a bestseller, and he said that the world is coming to pieces, the environment is falling apart, And so we need to abandon capitalism and shift to communism. And his book became a bestseller, selling for like 500,000 copies. So he's very pessimistic that this is the end of the world. But other scholars say that because of technical development or because of the economic incentive structure, the global environment is not going to be that bad. So not a few scholars say that we still have hope. So given that there are still different views on to what level the climate change will progress, I think it's problematic to take such a forcible measure, thinking of my impulse to democracy, as I mentioned earlier.
Comment. Would anybody else like to add some thoughts to that? Or do we have time for one more question? Yeah. Otherwise, maybe one more question or comment.
I would just say that I really appreciate that analogy of the theological kind of or mythical kind of characteristics that the conversation around sustainability has taken on. I mean, if you're a cynic and you look at the global conversation around sustainability, it seems like a ritual, right? It seems like I'm not saying that the people involved, many of the people involved, are not very serious about the solutions that they're proposing, but at a political level, it seems like there is an aspect of legitimation or deferment that if we continue to go through the motions of global summits and agreements, but without ever making tangible progress, that this is that's kind of like you can make the analogy to the theological, religious aspect of it, that it's this like this alchemy, like this social alchemy in which we're involved, that can be frustrating at times because you feel like we're not making much progress. So I appreciate that analogy. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions or comments to the panel as a whole or to individual presenters?
Well, thank you very much for such an attractive discussion. My name is Ansuko. I belong to the Nagoya University. So in regards to the sustainability, upon doing the research for the sustainability, I feel the difficulty in doing the research. So if there is anyone who would like to give a comment in regards to the difficulty in studying the sustainability, I would like to know. Well, depending on the cultures and the region, the geography, actually how we can respond to the sustainability can change, which I think poses the biggest difficulty upon doing the research. For example, if we say that this is particularly a good policy, such policy cannot be applicable for all the contexts. Each community, each person would have to look for the most optimal solution. In that sense, the solution is changing all over the time, which I think is quite difficult. But if we try to work on the research of that, generally, for example, we need to be objective upon treating the data, but sometimes that is quite difficult when we try to do the research on sustainability. Therefore, as to how we work on the research on this, I think should be changed. I think there is room for the improvement in doing the research in sustainability. There is no answer to this question, so I'm not really looking for that one answer, but I just want to know your take in regards to this issue.
Who would like to comment on this? Annaka Sensei, he looks like as though he's about to say something. Please, Annaka Sensei.
Well, thank you very much for the question. I agree that so I conduct statistical studies, and so looking at data, I can see where you're coming from. So in the previous question,
どういう観点から主張してるかっていうか、こういろんなもう絶対に
As I answered the previous question, it's really about what kind of perspective you're taking. So if there is no hope for the planet, perhaps you come up with one solution. On the other hand, if you think that the environment is still okay and we're still able to make improvements through these existing framework like SDGs and so on, and so, for example, economic gaps have been growing smaller, as shown in the book Factfulness. So there are evidence for both sides, and in some cases the evidence is extreme, one showing that things are getting better, the other showing that things are getting worse. So, as you said, just one uniform policy may not be the answer. I think that is cause for concern to say that this one-size-fits-all solution is going to solve everything. I think we need to implement various policies from different perspectives and try to find an equilibrium. I'm sorry I wasn't able to.
Thank you very much. I'm sure we could go on talking about these very interesting problems, but we do have to leave it here. We're out of time. So please join me in thanking the presenters for their wonderful presentations.